You sit at the edge of a long table carved from dark walnut. Dozens of plates stretch ahead of you. Silver, gold, porcelain stacked in ritual. Steam lifts from roasted game. Sweat from a dozen servants clings to the air. Somewhere near the doors a dog whines. But no one moves. Not yet. Because the king hasn't raised his spoon. It's quiet. Not like a church. Like a trap. Forks hover. Eyes flick toward the throne. Musicians at the back hold their breath. You are not here to eat. You are here to be seen eating. This is no ordinary meal. This is a royal public feast. A performance of hierarchy masked in gravy. A sermon served with bone marrow, and everyone knows their part. The nobles sit close to the monarch, placed not by hunger, but by favour. The closer your seat, the more your presence is worth. The better the cut of meat, the thicker the sauce, the cleaner the wine. Farther down the table, things spoil faster. You don't wipe your mouth freely. You don't chew loudly. You don't drink unless the king drinks first. You watch. Because appetite here is power, and power must be performed precisely. When the monarch finally lifts his spoon, slow, deliberate, theatrical, there's no applause, just motion, gentle, uniform, 100 people cutting into their food as if on cue. You follow, because not doing so would mark you, and in this hall being marked is worse than being ignored. You take a bite, the meat is undercooked, the fat coats your tongue, you chew anyway. Because nothing here is about pleasure. This isn't food for nourishment, it's food for show. Your stomach knots, you swallow, you smile. That's what's expected. A servant appears at your elbow with a damp cloth. Another replaces your wine glass before it's even half empty. No one speaks to them. No one thanks them. They move like ghosts, quiet and precise, trained to vanish before you even register their presence. Across the table, someone belches. No one reacts. He's a duke. He can afford it. You glance down the table and see a girl, 14 maybe. Her corset's so tight she can't sit upright. She pretends to nibble, but the food remains untouched. She's here to be watched, not fed. She looks at the king when he laughs. She laughs a moment later. The queen doesn't touch her plate at all. Behind her, 4 pages stand with linen cloth in case she faints. Another stands with a basin in case she vomits. This is not strange. This is a ceremony. Your plate is replaced again. You didn't ask. No one asks. Now, the fish course. Your eyes water from the scent, salted, fermented, spiced past recognition. The man beside you gags slightly, dabs his mouth, and pretends it didn't happen. You do the same. You don't ask what kind of fish. You don't ask why it's cold. You don't ask why the sauce is green. You eat. Because this is a ritual, and the rule of ritual is obey. The banquet lasts 3 hours, 16 courses, bread so dry it shatters, wine so sharp it stings, game meat so heavy it turns to clay in your throat. By the end, you are full, but not fed. You're exhausted from pretending. Your stomach aches not from food, but from the performance of being above hunger, of being noble, of being worthy of your seat. The king stands, everyone rises, a prayer is said, not for the food, for the throne, and just like that, it's over. Servants rush in with basins, with clothes, with sponges soaked in rose water to blot the grease from faces that must now look divine again. The table is stripped. The scraps are fed to dogs, or peasants, or burned. You walk out past the gilded doors, past the guards, past the crowd of commoners who came to watch the feast like a play. They believe what they saw. They believe you ate like royalty. Only you know the truth. You were fed nothing but rules. She sits straight, hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes trained not on the food before her, but on the dozens of faces watching her chew. The queen, a woman-turned monument, draped in embroidered silk so tight she can't bend forward, jewels at her throat, rings heavy enough to leave dents in the bread she won't touch. Her lips are painted, her cheeks powdered, her appetite censored. A servant cuts her meat. Another wipes the blade. She waits. Not for hunger. That ended hours ago. She waits for the king to nod. He does. So she eats. Small, delicate bites. Measured, practiced, silent. She doesn't open her mouth too wide. She doesn't let her teeth show. She chews with the grace of someone who's been trained to make digestion look elegant. Because it isn't about the meal. It's about the performance. Royal women were judged not by what they said, but how they chewed. Not by how much they knew, but how little they wanted. A queen who ate too quickly was vulgar. A queen who reached for the salt was impatient. A queen who seemed to enjoy her food too much was dangerous. So she learned to eat like a ghost. Her body, however, didn't always cooperate. She's not yet 30, but already the pregnancies have thickened her waist. She hides it beneath layers of silk. Still, the court whispers, she's grown round. She's not as dainty as she was. Perhaps she should eat less. They say this while watching her carve a sliver of pigeon breast no larger than a coin, and when she lifts it to her mouth, they all see it. Not the meat, the mouth of a woman capable of speech, of pleasure, of hunger, and hunger makes them nervous, because hunger means agency, because a woman who eats is a woman who wants, and want in the court is a dangerous thing. So they prefer her silence, still, beautiful, starving. Marie Antoinette was accused of decadence not because she gorged herself, but because she dared to eat sweetened cream in public, because she smiled while biting into sugared violets, because she licked powdered sugar from her fingers. They turned her into a monster for it. Not because she ate like a pig, because she ate like a person. Catherine de' Medici brought forks to France, and they called her unnatural. Elizabeth I was rumoured to refuse meat in front of guests, and when she grew thin, they said it was piety. But it was fear, because the eyes never stopped watching. A queen's stomach belonged to the crown. Every bite held meaning. Every refusal, a message. Eat too much, indulgent. Eat too little, sick. Eat slowly, vain. Eat quickly, unrefined. So she learned to pretend, to chew without swallowing, to dab her lips more than her tongue touched food, to tilt her head and hum politely at the flavour while letting the fat roll down her throat. Her hunger wasn't erased, just hidden. In private, maybe she ate more. In secret corners, maybe she sucked the juice from figs until it ran down her wrist. Maybe she wept over bread rolls she could finally devour without shame. But in public, she remained a statue, decorated, restrained, digestible. That was her role. To be fed by others, watched by everyone, and remembered not for what she loved, but for what she refused. They called it refinement, but what it really was madness in velvet gloves. Aristocratic dining, they said, was the height of civilization. But beneath the silver trays and golden goblets, everything reeked of decay. Sweat masked by rosewater, sour wine, half-rotted game dressed in cinnamon and clove. The table stretched the length of the chamber. Servants stood still as statues, waiting for signals no one else could see. The rules? Endless, absurd, and sacred. Don't rest your elbows. Don't use the wrong knife. Don't wipe your mouth more than once per course. Don't take the last bite, even if it's meant for you. Don't touch fruit before the designated hour. Don't cough. Don't burp. Don't weep, even if your corset is cutting off your breath. And never, under any circumstances, show hunger. Food wasn't meant for pleasure. It was meant for display, to show power, to flaunt control, to act like chewing roasted boar in front of 100 people was as normal as breathing. One royal, Louis XIV, kept dozens of staff just to ensure the symmetry of his courses. Fish had to face east. Meat garnishes had to mirror one another. If a roast was uneven, it was sent back, not to be fixed, but to be destroyed. because error had no place at the king's table. Napkins were folded in specific symbolic patterns, swans for peace, crescents for power. If a servant got it wrong, he could be dismissed. Austrian nobility practiced something stranger: mouth servants. Boys trained to chew pieces of meat first, softening them, then placing them delicately into the mouths of lords too genteel to risk looking grotesque in front of peers. They called it etiquette, but it was grooming. Disgust covered in lace. If a royal had bad teeth, the food was pureed. If they lacked the strength to lift a spoon, a page would feed them as if they were infants. The court applauded. They called it grace. Meanwhile, in the shadows of the feast hall, basins were prepared, not for cleaning, but for vomiting. Because feasting was relentless. There were no breaks, no enough. Refusing a dish could be seen as an insult. Leaving the table too soon, disrespect. So nobles learned to empty themselves in secret and return to the table for more. Behind the curtains, bowls filled with bile sat beside platters of roast swan and almond tarts. You had to make room. Some whispered that queens fainted on purpose, just to escape the nausea of forced indulgence. Others stuffed perfumed cloth into their bodices to ward off the stench, of meat gone soft, of bodies gone sour, of hunger gone wrong. In Russia, under the Tsars, certain dishes were never to be touched by the royals at all, merely admired. They were carved sculptures made of sugar, moulded fruits painted with gold leaf. You didn't eat them, you marvelled. And if your marvelling seemed weak, you were accused of lacking refinement. Even dessert became judgment. A courtier once dropped a fork at the Habsburg table and was banished. Not because of the noise, but because the act suggested anxiety. And anxiety meant weakness. So nobles trained themselves to be statues with moving mouths. Every bite rehearsed, every blink calculated, every shiver swallowed. They feasted on protocol, they dined in fear, and when it was over, they returned to their rooms, bloated, dizzy, soaked in sweat, and whispered that it had been divine. Because to admit the truth, that it had been grotesque, would have meant exile, or worse, banishment from the table. They lined up at the gates by dawn, not for bread, not for work, but to watch the king eat. At Versailles, in the Hall of Mirrors, a rope separated royalty from commoner, but that rope wasn't to keep people out. It was to let them see. The king's meals were public, intentional, and utterly hollow, because to see a king eat was to believe he was more than a man. He dined in silence, surrounded by nobles, servants, and pages, all playing their roles with precision. Every gesture was choreographed, every motion was watched. When the monarch lifted a spoon, those in the room inhaled. When he chewed, they exhaled. He didn't smile, he didn't laugh. He performed stillness, and the public, they marvelled. Women in wool shawls stood shoulder to shoulder with merchant boys and travelling monks, craning their necks just to catch a glimpse of the fork entering his mouth. They watched him break bread and whispered as if he were performing a miracle. They didn't see the rot beneath the gold. They didn't see the crust on the meat, or the oil pooling at the edge of his plate, or the servant who tested each bite for poison before the king touched it. They saw order, luxury, divine right. Because in an age of hunger, what greater proof of power than to eat in front of the starving? In Spain, peasants were allowed to observe the king's table from elevated windows behind lattices. In Austria, selected townspeople were invited into the dining chamber to bow before the roast was carved. They were not fed, they were not thanked, they were shown. And being shown was considered a gift. For queens, the ritual was sharper. When Marie Antoinette sat down to eat, she was not alone. Dozens of noble women attended. Each had a role, handing her gloves, adjusting her napkin, announcing the arrival of soup as if it were an envoy. Commoners sometimes watched from behind silk screens. They saw her dab her lips. They saw her take 2 bites. Then she left. They applauded. They didn't know she hadn't eaten all day. They didn't know she vomited most mornings. They didn't know that behind the powdered face was a woman who barely remembered the taste of a hot meal alone. But it didn't matter. What mattered was the illusion that royalty consumed differently, beautifully, righteously, even if they didn't consume at all. Public meals weren't meant to feed. They were meant to hypnotize, so that the people below would keep starving in silence, grateful just to glimpse the crumbs. The king is sweating, not from heat, not from nerves, but from sheer volume. He has eaten 6 courses already. Another is coming. He doesn't want it. But he can't say no, because kings don't refuse generosity, and generosity is measured in meat. He shifts in his chair, stomach bloated, belt loosened behind his embroidered waistcoat. The servants know. They've seen it before. They bring the next course anyway. Pheasant stuffed with oysters, wrapped in goose skin, soaked in clove butter. He nods. Because the dish was sent by a powerful duke, and refusing it would mean dishonour. So he eats, slowly, mechanically, like a man digging his own grave with a spoon. This isn't gluttony, it's duty. In Tudor England, meals were warfare by plate. Courtiers presented dishes to the monarch as a form of loyalty. Rejecting a dish insulted the giver. Finishing it proved favour. Henry VIII didn't eat because he was hungry. He ate because people needed him to. A king's appetite was a measure of stability, and so he performed hunger, even when his stomach churned, even when his teeth ached, even when the gout made it agony to hold a fork. At times, he chewed until his gums bled, and the courtiers mirrored him. They ate when he ate, paused when he paused, laughed when he laughed, mouths still full, tongues burning, cheeks swollen with food they didn't want, because imitation was survival. In Spain, under Philip IV, the court was fed in silence. If the king frowned, the entire room lowered their forks. If he left a dish untouched, no one else dared eat it. Once, a foreign noble mistook this for coincidence and kept chewing after the monarch had stopped. He was never invited back. Because the table was not for eating, it was for submitting. The performance of appetite was a political language. Too much, and you were greedy. Too little, and you were ungrateful. Too early, and you were presumptuous. Too late, and you were slow. It was not about the food. It was about who controlled when you were allowed to feel hunger, and how much of yourself you had to sacrifice to hide it. One queen fainted after her 5th pregnancy and was scolded, not for being unwell, but for disrupting the dinner. Another noblewoman lost her position after vomiting mid-banquet. Her offence wasn't a weakness, it was breaking the illusion. Because at the royal table discomfort was a privilege. To suffer in silence, to smile while choking on undercooked goose, proved your loyalty better than any oath. And the higher your rank, the more you were expected to endure. You could bleed in private, but at the table you obeyed. The plates shimmered beneath the chandeliers, gold-edged, hand-painted, gleaming. But you didn't see the hands that cleaned them, or the lungs that filled with ash below the stairs. Royal feasts weren't built in the dining room, they were built in the kitchens, or what passed for them, vast sweltering cellars beneath palaces, where the air never moved and the smoke never cleared. At Hampton Court, there were more than 200 cooks and scullions at any given time. They didn't wear white coats. They didn't speak. They sweated through linen soaked with grease and coal dust, working beside flames so hot the walls cracked. You wouldn't recognise their faces, because no one looked at them, just their work. The tables above glittered. The tables below burned. In French royal kitchens, boys as young as 10 were assigned to turn spits. Whole pigs, deer, swans, roasted slowly for hours. The handles blistered their palms. They wrapped rags around them until the rags caught fire. Some were permanently bent at the wrist by the time they were 16. They were called rôtisseurs. But no one used their names. They worked beside pots the size of bathtubs. They stirred sauces with paddles taller than themselves, They didn't taste. They didn't sit. They moved until the bell rang. Then they vanished. Because the nobility couldn't be reminded of the labour beneath luxury. Every crust of bread on the king's table had passed through 14 pairs of hands. Bakers, millers, salt porters, water carriers, none of them invited to the meal. And when a course was returned uneaten, it wasn't fed to the staff, it was fed to the animals, because the table's waste was still considered too fine for those who prepared it. A young scullery girl at a German court lost 3 fingers to a cleaver. She was dismissed the next morning, not for the injury, but because she bled where the guests might have seen. She begged to stay. Her family depended on her wages. But the head steward said, "A bleeding girl ruins the appetite." They replaced her with another. The rules in the kitchen were different from those upstairs. There was no etiquette, no second chances, only steam and speed. Those who slowed the line were whipped. Those who spoke too loudly were dismissed. Those who cried were ignored. But still, they worked. Because to serve the table, even from below, was better than starving. And so they kept feeding the fire, scrubbing the floors, carrying the plates, knowing they would never taste what they touched, knowing that every feast above came with its price paid in sweat, in burns, in breath that reeked of soot. The feast sparkled, and beneath it someone choked. They said it was a blessing to dine with the king. But no one wanted to take the first bite, not even the king himself. Because sometimes the roast wasn't just meat, and sometimes the wine wasn't just sour. Sometimes the meal was a weapon. You couldn't see the poison. That was the point. It was a bitter root mixed with fig paste, powdered arsenic stirred into honey glaze, crushed pearl laced into wine. Toxin was so subtle it took hours, sometimes days, to bloom in the blood. By then the feast was long over, and the killer had vanished. So the rituals grew stranger. Before the monarch lifted his fork, a taster stepped forward. He took the first bite of every course, chewed slowly, swallowed, waited. The room would watch, not for etiquette this time, for collapse. They didn't call them servants, they called them shields, and sometimes they died. A young page in the Polish court once dropped dead over fish stew. The plate was removed. No one else was served. The kitchen was interrogated. The cook disappeared. No trial, no burial. His name was never recorded. The Tsars of Russia were more paranoid. Entire regiments of food testers stood outside the palace kitchens, assigned in shifts. They tasted meat, wine, bread, even fruit, each from the same batch that would be served. Not just once, 3 times, under watch. Still, men died. Because poison evolved. Because hatred found new recipes. Catherine de' Medici was rumoured to have her own poisoners. She sent them with perfume bottles and sugar confections, tiny, deadly gifts wrapped in lace. Some said her pastries killed more nobles than her armies. At Versailles, dishes were sealed with wax stamped by the royal crest. If the wax was cracked, the plate was discarded. If a servant even looked suspicious, the whole course was sent back to the kitchens, and the kitchen was locked. But even then, trust was fragile. Wine glasses were rinsed in holy water. Spoons were wiped with vinegar-soaked cloth. Some monarchs insisted on silver forks, believing the metal would blacken in the presence of poison. It didn't. But fear had its own logic. One queen refused to eat anything she hadn't grown herself. Another only accepted meals from her childhood nurse, now an old woman shaking hands. Still, the fear never left. Because in the court, death didn't come with swords anymore. It came on platters, in creams, in jellies, in gifts. And those who smiled across the table might not be guests. They might be executioners. So kings learned to pretend, to lift their goblets with grace, even as their fingers trembled, to smile at their guests even as their stomachs twisted, to eat, knowing that every swallow might be the last, because at the royal table, Death was always watching. And sometimes it was already in the mouth, was already in. The feast never truly ended. It just rotted slowly in plain sight. By the late 18th century, the spectacle of royal dining had become a farce. The velvet was still red, the silver was still polished. But something had changed. The public stopped clapping. They still gathered, still watched. But the ore was thinner now, brittle. Beneath the gilded edges of the banquet hall, they saw something they hadn't seen before. Hunger. Not the performative kind, not the kind dressed in etiquette manuals and crystal goblets. Real hunger. Children pressed their faces against palace gates while kings sipped soup with golden spoons. Bakers were hanged for short loaves while queens pushed away glazed pears. The stomachs outside the palace twisted, and the ones inside tried not to look, but it was too late. The performance had cracked. When the revolution came, the kitchens were looted first. People didn't want thrones. They wanted bread. They dragged royal chefs into the streets, not because they hated the recipes, but because they hated that so many hands had bled to prepare what they would never taste. Feasting was no longer a power. It was proof. Proof of blindness. Proof of waste. Proof of rule so distant it no longer knew what real food smelled like. Marie Antoinette's last meal was plain. No ceremony, no court, no tasting page, just broth and bread, eaten under guard. There were no crowds to admire her appetite, just silence. She walked to the scaffold on an empty stomach, and the people cheered. Not because they loved death, but because they had once watched her eat cake she never ordered, in a palace they couldn't enter, on a plate that cost more than a year's rent. The rituals died with her. Slowly, royal meals became private again. The forks lost their shine. The tablecloths lost their starch. The illusion faded, and the performance ended. But the hunger never did. Because beneath every royal table, there had always been someone kneeling, someone sweating, someone starving, just outside the curtain, waiting.